There's three things I want us to focus on, or not focus on, but keep in the back of our mind. And one is the world is not random. We can go over to the philosophy department and have an argument whether, the universe is randomly structured or there's, some sort of force behind it. That's not important here. What I mean is the world is not random. There are physical laws at play, there are biological principles at play, and there are patterns. And as biologists, as scientists, we look for patterns. The ultimate origin of those patterns, well, that's maybe for philosophers and theologists to talk about, but there are patterns, and we focus on those. And when you identify a series of whatever you're studying, and they follow a pattern very consistently, this one, this one, this one, this one, and then you get something that's outside that pattern, that's interesting. Why is it? Am I looking at it wrong, or is it really different? So we focus on that. It's an ecological principle, and no such thing as a free lunch. This is not an ecology class, but we're going to hit ecology along the way, and that's just a little shorthand way of saying that everything has a cost. Everything an organism does has an upside, the lunch, and a downside. There's a cost, a risk taken, something expended. And nature is a perfect recycler. No lunch goes uneaten. Everyone's waste is somebody else's food, and the processes are in cycles. Again, not something we touch a lot in this class, but it's worth hitting. With regard to evolution, we spent a lot of time talking about evolution, the results of evolution. So let's look at that. Evolution does not give perfection. We can look at an adaptation, or we can look at a creature and go, wow, isn't that spectacular, how it just like hand in glove fits into its biology. But it's not perfect. Evolution doesn't give you perfection. Evolution gives you two things. It gives you good enough to do your job, whatever it is you need to do, and it gives you better than anyone else. As long as you're good enough at what you do, getting food, avoiding predators, finding shelter, as long as you're good enough, you're okay. And as long as you're better than anyone else, no one else can take that away from you. Evolution has two facets. When we touch upon evolution, there's two facets to look at. One is there's history. And we're going to spend some time with history. There's ancestors, there's ancient stuff. And with the fossil record, we can piece that together. So there's history. That's one component of evolution. That's the component we look at in this class. Everything is interrelated. Is our next concept. Everything is interrelated. This is, again, a more ecological concept. So there's a food web. Everyone in the system plays off everyone else, or at least a lot of the different pieces are important to the other organisms. And from a human perspective, when we bring conservation discussions in as appropriate, I like to emphasize that here we are, and we derive our support, our food and our water, and our oxygen, and our carbon removal happens in natural or modified systems like agricultural fields or forests or rainforests or oceans. That's our support system, and we in turn impact this. And when we impact these systems beyond their ability to support us, that becomes non-sustainable. It may work for 100 years, it may work for 500 years, but it may not work forever. We need to keep that in mind. So the natural interrelatedness, and then we need to remember we're part of these systems too. Okay. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about evolution because I recognize a lot of you in Bio 200, so you did it there. And I assume you've had evolution, but I want to review it because I talk in kind of a shorthand. I talk about a group of animals, like I'll say, the tetrapods, that's the land animals. I say, well, their ancestor invented limbs for walking. That's not really what I mean. It's just shorthand. In other words, limbs evolved in their ancestor, And that was a favorable trait, so it got carried on. But in shorthand, I might say they got invented there, they were developed there. But let's review evolution just briefly. Remember, evolution is a natural process. Something we can study. I just did this. I was a whole day before what I just did and what I'm doing now. So, remember, we're not looking for perfection here. Although we can look at exquisitely adapted creatures. It gives us good enough and better than anyone else. Evolution has these two facets to it. It's got the history, and I touched upon that a minute ago. The history, which is really where we are, the facet, that's where we really are here, is, I'm going to make an edit here, ancient to modern. But there's another aspect, and this is the aspect we don't play a lot with in a class like this, and that's the process. How does evolutionary change happen? How did we go from an aquatic creature in the Devonian, an aquatic fish-like vertebrate, to a terrestrial salamander-like vertebrate? What was the process? What was going on there? And that's something we don't play with a lot in this class, but I want to just review it real quickly. The natural process is not magic, and we can study it. And our understanding of it was back, our attempts to understand it go back a couple hundred years, but our real understanding with it starts with Charles Darwin. And we don't need to review everything he did or everything he said, but I do want to focus on how evolution works, and it really starts with him in our modern understanding of it. He gave us his book in 1859 on the origin of species by means of natural selection. He gave us a mechanism to understand how the process of evolution works. So, he called it descent with modification. We call it evolution. By the way, this is the last sentence in his book. And that's the only time in the whole book this word appears. Evolved. But, let me read that later. But he called it descent with modification through natural selection. So I want to look at natural selection and change in general real quickly. I hope this is review. Darwin laid out an argument to explain natural selection, and his argument had basically three parts, and then some conclusions you make off those three parts. And he said three things. He said, populations have the capacity to over-reproduce. Populations grow. So, wildebeests here, or whatever those are. I think it was wildebeests. Populations grow. Within the population, not everyone's exactly the same. Number two, there's variation. One, populations grow. Two, there's variation within our population. Three, the variation is inheritable. If you have blue eyes, there's a chance your kids are going to have blue eyes. There's something about you that get passed on to the next generation. Your variance, your variant, whatever your variable is, gets passed to the next generation. People have known that since there have been people. But he put these three ideas together. Populations over-reproduce. There's variation within the population. And the variation is heritable. He put these three ideas together, and he gave us natural selection. He made two inferences. One, survival is not random. The population is going to put more individuals in the environment than that environment can support. Some of those individuals aren't going to make it. The environment's going to come at those individuals. Oh, you're not as good. You're not as tall. The environment says you need to be tall. You don't make it if you're not tall. The environment says you need to be able to survive cold temperatures. You can't do it. You don't get to survive. So survival is not random, and anything that helps you survive gets passed to the next generation. So if you have a piece of genetic information that says you're tall, you pass that into the next generation. An individual without that piece of information doesn't pass its content on. So the genetic content of each generation is molded by nature, natural selection. This is a review, right? Okay. This is the starting point of really understanding evolution. Is giving us a mechanism to understand how it works. One more time. Evolution doesn't give perfection. It gives good enough and better than anyone else. At any one point in time, you've got to be good enough and better than anyone else. And we're going to talk about these really cool fish-like things that came out of water and started living on land. And they became the first terrestrial vertebrates. They sucked at it. But they were better than anyone else. And they were good enough. They would never make it today because we've got birds and mammals, all sorts of other things coming in and eating them. But when they first came out of the water, they weren't good at it by any stretch of the imagination. But they're the only ones doing it, so that's by definition better than anyone else. And they were able to do it. So, evolution is driven by fitness. And that's a concept I want to get back in your vocabulary. Even not there. Fitness, in an evolutionary sense, has a very specific meaning. And selection is based on that fitness. Selection comes into our population, and those that make it are the ones we call fit. Fitness is your success at life. Here's the mama. There's the baby. That's her fitness. Remember that concept? Fitness is your reproductive output. Let me just put it bluntly like that. And selection favors those individuals with high fitness. Well, let's put it that way. If you have selection has favored you, you have high fitness. You get to put your offspring in the next generation. So whatever it is about her, whatever variant she had that made her good at what she's doing, her kid has it. And he'll pass it on to her offspring. So evolution is based on fitness. It's based on your reproductive output. Your reproductive output is based on the environment coming at you and saying, oh, you're working this year. Oh, you're not working this year. So selection applies to variation. In any population, there's going to be variation. Everyone's not exactly the same. And selection will favor certain variants over others. We good so far? Review, right? This is really important. And after years of doing this, particularly at the Bio 200 level, it occurred to me this is what people are not grasping. The variation is random. It arises randomly. And you all took genetics, right? That was another one of the courses I did really poorly at. I had a lot of math, and I'm not good at anything that's math. Partly mental. I could do it if I wanted to. I just never did. But within our population, different variations, different variants will arise randomly. Remember that genetic process called mutation? Okay. So variants arise randomly. And so if you got a population, whoop, a mutated allele means you're a little bit bigger than everybody else. Maybe that's fit. That new allele becomes increasingly prominent through natural selection from generation to generation, right? Selection acts on this variation. If everyone in the population is exactly the same, there's no selection. But when we're different, that opens us up to selection. And here's the thing that I realized recently people didn't understand. You don't get to pick your variation. You can't pick your adaptation. Here's the beaver there. Beavers chop down trees for a living. I wish I had a chainsaw. I wish I had a chainsaw. That's an adaptation I want. Doesn't work that way. The population isn't sitting there saying it's getting colder. I need more fur. Oh, I got more fur. The way the world works, if you've got a population and it's getting colder, and one individual, through some genetic mutation, has more fur than everyone else, that individual has more fitness then. Gets to pass that trait on. So you don't get to pick your adaptations. They arise randomly, and selection either favors them or disfavors them. Okay? That's like 3 days in Bio 200. We good? All right. How do we track evolution? And how do we focus on it? And we're going to look at a lot of these evolutionary trees. In your textbook, this is out of your textbook. This is one of them that it presents, and this one has time on it, right? Across the horizontal axis there. And when these different things appear. That's one way to look at evolution relationships. And we see here, we have the vertebrates up here. Here's another way. And again, this is out of your textbook, and this is the way I tend to look at it. It's laid out here as relationships, and we see here bonioperculum, part of second visual arch, blah, 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 blah. We see features, characters we call them. And the way you read that is I just focus on this one here, right here, in this ancestor, whoever this was, this ancestor evolved placoid scales and claspers. And that defines everybody upstream. We hypothesize that, we'll get that in a little bit, but there's claspers, it's a reproductive structure on something like a shark. And sharks have a particular kind of placoid, a scale called a placoid scale. And the way you read these is that those traits evolve here, everybody upstream shows those. And we don't see those traits anywhere else because this is where they evolved. So we can go back here, disc-like buccal funnel, long larval stage, is amazy, blah, 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 blah. That trait evolved here. Those traits evolved here. These traits evolved here. And so everybody upstream shows that. And that's how you read these evolutionary trees. And as we walk through these different kinds of vertebrates, we're going to stop and look at these evolutionary trees, and we're going to come to a group, whether it be a crowd called the chondrichthyes, the cartilaginous fishes, and we're going to say, what's unique about them? That's the first thing we're going to do. What's unique about them? What did their ancestor do? And again, their ancestor didn't sit back there and think, oh, damn, I want claspers. The claspers appear back then. And was a useful trait? It's carried on, at least in this group here. That make sense? Okay. So like I said, you can't pick your adaptations. They show up randomly. And if they give the individual fitness, they get maintained. We're good so far? All right, let's kill that. And here, kind of setting the stage here. Okay, we're done with this. Here's another way I like to start talking about diversity by talking about how we, from a zoology class, we've done this, but I modified it for vertebrates. It's an invertebrate version, there's a fish version, there's this version. But I want to give you my take. I may put this a little more quickly than I normally do because it's summer, but I want to give a take on how we do classification, because we spend a lot of time saying that's, this particular order or family or whatever. I want to get us up to speed on that. So classification is the making sense of diversity. And so a little bit of philosophy here, a little bit of methodology. How do we make sense of diversity? One of the first things we want to address is what's a species? These are little North American stream fish. It's called darters. Go to the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and you'd find these in clear streams all over the place. There's about 150 species of them. But there you go. What is it when we say species? What do we mean? What is that? And there's different ways to look at species. Basically, a species is an independent evolutionary lineage. So each of these evolutionary lineages, we're going to give a name. If it's a terminal lineage, we'll call it a species. There's a bunch of darters here again. So think of species as evolutionary lineages going back in time. We're just looking at one slice through time. One of the things we see, partly as an effect of the fact that they're separate evolutionary lineages, one of the things we can look at as species and we can see these are populations, groups of individuals with separate gene pools. That's kind of a traditional way of looking at species. Another way to put that is if this is species A and this is species, oh God, I have a board here. If this is species A, it's, species space. and not a very good pen. And there's species B, separate gene pools. And kind of what we mean by that is individuals in species A never breed with individuals in species B, and individuals in species B never breed with species A. In other words, there's no gene flow, and it's not going to work. There's no gene flow between the two populations. That's a very convenient way to talk about species, but again, we tend to think of species as evolutionary lineages. This is kind of an outcome of that. One of the nice things about species, at least we like to think this way, is we're smart enough to tell them apart. We have field guides, some of them very, very technical, where you can identify different species. And there's characteristics you can look at, color, pattern, shape, things like that, and we can tell them apart frequently. So that brings us to classification. If we can identify things, and people have enjoyed identifying things as long as there's in people thinking. We give things names. This is dangerous. This is not dangerous. But that's classification, categorizing things, and we want to look at a little bit of that. From the earliest classification we know of was, those in pictures ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets that they would write on it with little triangular stabs with a little tool. And they had a language. It's one of the earliest written languages we know of, and someone has found one of those little clay tablets, and it's a list of all the animals in the king's zoo. And that's kind of cool. And that's one of the earliest classifications we know of. Even in the book of Genesis, we have classification. Man gave names to all the animals. So, we've been doing this forever. One of the first things you need to be able to do if you're doing any kind of study, and some of you might go in and you work for the state in a conservation office or a private consulting firm, and you might do environmental impact statements or a survey before they put a shopping center on a piece of land. And one of the first things you need to be able to do is you need to be able to identify the pieces in your system. What are you looking at? Were they plants or animals or insects or whatever? And one of the most important things you need to be able to do if you're doing a study is you need to be able to identify the things you're looking at. You got to know what you're studying, and that's something that's an aspect of science that's lost on a lot of people. A lot of people are working with organisms, and they're relying on other people to do their identifications for them, and people who are competent in doing those identifications don't get jobs anymore, and so that aspect in a lot of sciences is dying. But you need to know what you're studying. If you think you're studying a particular species of plant from a population genetic perspective or from whatever, and you're mixing three things up, your study doesn't have any validity. So knowing what you're studying is pretty important, and this is my example. A friend of mine, my office mate when I was in grad school, was studying this little western minnow and all across the western streams, and he needed specimens from all over the west from different streams. He was doing a genetic study of them, and he was grinding them up from different river systems and categorizing their genes. And he would send a $50 bill and a little refrigerated box with a piece of dry ice in it to game people all over the West and beg them to go out and collect him a handful of these and FedEx them. And people are very accommodating, fellow scientists, and he got them. And one day he was opening up some specimens that he got sent from somewhere in Wyoming, and I was with him. He opened them up and he pulled these things out. Not these things exactly, but these are baby trout. So the guy went out to catch him some fish, got the first 3 small fish he could find, froze them, and sent it to him, and they're trout. Not the thing he was studying. And I know a lot of molecular geneticists who wouldn't have known the difference between a trout and the thing they're actually studying or think they're studying, and would have thrown those data into the pool with a bit of mess. You need to be able to recognize what you're doing. So anyway, classification is the ordering of diversity. Let's look at that. So here is the basic set of ranks. This is a classification system, and this should just be, if it's not already, just part of your biological knowledge. These ranks here, from biggest to smallest: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Every species, we'll talk about this later, every species gets this 2-part name. This happens to be a steelhead trout. Oncorhynchus micus is its species name. And then these higher categories: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The domain being the highest. So we're playing with one right in here, vertebrata, which is subphylum, right between phylum and class. And let's say little rhymes. Domain, the category domain was added to the top in the 90s. It's actually only about 20 years old. And if you go online, you can find little rhymes. King Philip cut open 5 Girl Scouts. Kindly pay cash or furnish good security, which is much more boring than the King Philip one. And there's lots of other ones. Some of them involve genitals and things like that. These units, they're called taxa. Now, what's the word I want to start using? It's a generic word. Any one of these is a taxon. Taxon's the singular, taxa are plural. So class is a taxon, as is genus. Taxon does not imply where you are. It's just the category. That's a word I want to start using. And we found, these are the traditional ones. Some of these go back to Linnaeus in the 1700s. What have we got there? 6, I got 8 there. We found we needed more. And these are some I found. I just cut and pasted off a website. There's a whole bunch of them out there. Cohort and subclass and infraorder and parv order. I've never heard of parv order. But there's a bunch of in-betweens, and we don't deal with many in-betweens. Sometimes we might deal with, like I said, subphylum, vertebrata, or superclass or subclass. But for the most part, I try to stay within these. We're not going to, and it's gotten complicated. It would take 3 lectures to explain why. I don't want to. It's gotten, ranking things has gotten complicated. The way we assign rank now, oh, you're a family, no, you're a subfamily, that's gotten kind of complicated, and I don't want to deal with that. So I don't emphasize the ranks anymore. So some of them are pretty well established, like subphylum vertebrata, but a lot of them, some authorities will say that's a superorder, some will say it's a subclass. I don't want to play with that. So sometimes I'll just put something up and it'll be taxon aves, which is birds. We're not going to worry about whether it's a class or a subclass or an order. That makes sense? We know it's a group. What level it's at, we're not worried about it. So at its core, classification is about order. Because certain people have orderly minds, and so we like to order diversity. But it's also very important about order. It's about communication as well. We order things so we can understand them, but also so we can share with our colleagues. So I use these fish examples here. These are a bunch of native and non-native fish from Europe, and they've got their French names on. There's a French classification, at least, right? Most of you don't speak French. My French is I used to speak a fair amount of French. I haven't had a chance to practice in 20 years, so it's gone. But there's some of the same fish with an English arrangement there. So we need a system that works in different languages, for example. So there it is. These are some of those same fishes again. And these are those cool scientific names that you guys so carefully avoid, and I'm trying to encourage you not to. You want to call it a largemouth bass. Yeah, I know you do. But, oh shoot, it's not on this slide here. Micropter salmoides is a more universal name. Make these your friends. This is a universal system. There we go. We can find one here. Maybe not. There we go. Same fish, 2 different names. So classification tries to overcome disorder. There's a collection of stamps showing absolute disorder, just like you'd get from a stamp store, just a big box of mixed stamps. It's cool, but it's not very orderly. Classification is when you categorize things. You identify, you categorize, you classify, and you can organize, and you can see what you have, what you don't have. You can make catalogs or checklists, and we do the same thing with living things. There's disorder on a coral reef, and that's just a great place to go snorkeling and spend an afternoon or a week enjoying the riot of life, but it's hard to understand until you break it down into pieces. And you classify it, and you identify the taxa, and you generate guides to them. Some people think this takes the mystery out of life. I think it adds to our understanding. Order allows that understanding. Order isn't necessary for appreciation and valuing, but it's essential for understanding. So how do we define order? Different criteria we could use. Do we classify things according to their similarity? What do these things all share in common?
Color.
Color, they're all yellow. But if you were a biologist, would you put starfish in the same box with bugs? Probably wouldn't. But if you were classifying based on that, you would. Similarity. Into the 1800s, classifications of living things were based almost entirely on what our interaction with them was. Could you eat it? Would it bite you? Was it poisonous? Could you build a house with it? The nature guides were divided up into utility. Our interactions with things, good or bad or whatever. But there's other criteria. We'll come back to that. I'm summarizing, and I want to do this before we end for lunch. We're summarizing about 2,000 years of thought on this in just well, not a few more slides, but a handful more slides. We don't need to worry about all the details in this class. This is my way of thinking about classification. This is my science. This is what I used to do. I break it down into three groups, three activities: taxonomy, nomenclature, and systematics. These are the sciences of classification. Taxonomy is what we start off with. Taxonomy is the simplest, well, not the simplest one, it's the starting point, and we already touched upon that. Taxonomy is identifying your taxa, identifying your units, whatever you're going to call them, families or species or genera or whatever. Taxonomy is the identification of the different units, lining them up. So I found these cute pictures. These are button taxonomists. So they're faced with a variety of buttons, and now they're sorting. That's taxonomy. And there's a button taxonomy based on color. What else? If you were a button taxonomist, what else could you use besides color?
Shape.
Shape?
Size.
Size?
Amount of holes.
There you go. Amount of holes. What it's made of. How old they are. I mean, there's lots of categories. Color is typically the thing we go to first. We're very visual, but that's a taxonomy right there. Those cool pond fish called koi carp, the Japanese are very fond of them. And they bred all sorts of different kinds, and there's that koi taxonomy. And there are different kinds that you can go to a koi shop, and some of them are thousands of dollars. That's taxonomy. You just identify your pieces. The next step is nomenclature. Nomenclature is making sure each taxon has a unique name. Applying names to our taxa. Again, whether it's families or genera or species, everybody needs a unique name so we can communicate. Because remember, classification is about order, order is about communication. So everybody gets a unique name. There's that koi again. Everybody gets a unique name. That's the taxonomy. That's the nomenclature. And now we can talk about it. We need a universal system for nomenclature. That occurred to people about early 1900s, late 1800s. The universal system was needed, and I won't talk about that another day. But we have a universal system for applying names to things. So taxonomy and nomenclature. First two steps. We identify the taxa, and then we name them. Whatever system you want to use to name them, there you go. So people have been doing that forever. Starting in the 16, 17, 1800s, in Europe at least, I don't know about other cultures, in European cultures, these people tried to organize things further. It's all well and good to have 1,000 taxa, each one with a name, But sometimes some taxa, oh gosh, we can put them in a group. We can put, these 5 taxa, we can put them in the same box because they share something in common. And that's the next step up. That's called systematics. And systematics is organizing your taxa based on some set of patterns. We organize our taxa into more broadly inclusive groups. So we can take, these 5 taxa, species, and we'll put them into this genus. Or these 5 families, and put them into this order. So systematics is, we've got all our ground level taxa. Let's put these 15 in one group, these 15 in another group, these 20 in another group. That's systematics. We're starting to organize things at a higher level. So there you go. There's just a big bin of taxa. There's just loose, random things. But there we go. We organize them into higher groups. You go to your hardware store. Your taxa are different kinds of nails, but the next group up is nails. You've got 100 different kinds of screws, but they're all screws. That's the next category up. Fixins, I don't know what that is. Or bolts. So systematics is beginning to group things. I spent an hour looking for that slide. The perfect hardware store slide. So we're going to organize our taxa. The question is, what do we use? What criteria do we use? And we talked about some earlier. Similarity, right? Relation to humans. And then I left one out. I said other, with a question mark. What modern systematics is, and since Darwin gave us the permission to do this, modern systematics organizes things based on their evolutionary relationships. That is what we mean by systematics. If I put these 5 species, the next category up from species is genus. If I put these 5 species in the same genus, I'm saying you're each other's closest relatives. And if I put these 3 genera, next category up is family, I put 3 genera into a particular family, I'm saying these 3 genera are each other's closest relatives. We're using relationships. So we're not doing it based on similarity. Often, closely related things are similar to one another, right? But that's not what we're focusing on. And it's not just about us. Can I eat it? Yes, no. Is that the cutest rat you've ever seen? So it's evolutionary relationships, which we call genealogy, that we use to make our relationships. So this happens to be all mammals. We have a taxonomic category, a taxon, mammalia. We put all the mammals in it. All redundant, isn't it? All the animals of one type we put in this category called mammals. And we do that because of their ancestry. So, systematics, order is defined by relationships. You guys see a problem with this? There's a set of relationships with these African catfishes. Sometimes our hypotheses on these relationships changes. Damn. This might be what we thought 20 years ago, but someone else has much better data or more specimens and comes up with a new arrangement. So if we're basing our classification on relationships, we're basing it on something that sometimes changes. So much our classifications change. But our classification always has to match this. Whatever our best hypothesis is. So it doesn't horrify you guys to think that birds are reptiles, right? 20 years ago, that would have horrified some of you. You would have gone, I don't think so. But we put birds and reptiles now because of their relationships. But you go, birds are so different than lizards. Not that different. So that was an example of a change. When we came to understand that birds and reptiles are part of the same evolutionary radiation, birds become reptiles. Special type of reptile, but That was a change that about 20 years ago people were unhappy with, particularly bird people. So, summary. Identify your pieces, give them names, and organize them according to some set of criteria. We happen to use relationships. Okay. I'm just looking at it. Yeah, we'll do this. Summary is so different. You're going to see me sometimes saying edit here on the fly. And I realize you don't have these in front of you. I'm sorry they weren't up yet, but let me look here. Yeah, we'll do a little bit of this history. I think we have time. Our classification system that we use today is based on the Linnaean system. And there's our friend Carl Linnaeus. You've met him before if you've taken a class from me or I assume from Dr. Denton. He was the father of modern classification. He was a Swedish botanist, and details are not important. But he, in the 1700s, came up with the system we still use today, in large part. Not the methods, but the system. He came up with concepts like family and order and class. He gave us those taxa. And he classified all creation. His classification system started at the bottom end with dirt and the top end with people. And everything in between. And for a person like Linnaeus, there was no difference between a rock and a lizard in terms of creation. It's all a gift from the Creator, whether it's a rock or a lizard. It's just a continuum, the same thing. He would talk about creation as being animate. That's all the living stuff. Animate creation and inanimate creation. The stuff that doesn't live, the rocks and the gold and things like that. But for them, it was just one gift. And that's how they looked at it. We now pretty much separate living from non-living. Here's his classification, just for fun. Primates. That's his order. Order. Primates. That's still the order we use today. That's our order. And there's the genus, for example, genus Homo. That's the genus Urine, Homo sapiens. And he put a bunch of other things in the genus Homo. I don't know what all these things are. It's in Latin, but these are different kinds of monkeys and apes. Do we even see sapiens in here? Like there's Homo nocturnus, the orangutan. So there you go. He gave us a taxonomy, identified the pieces, and he gave us a very consistent nomenclature. And that was very, very important. We didn't have that before his time, consistent nomenclature. Once this thing got published in the 1750s, diversity studies really took off because a German scientist in Brazil could talk to a French scientist in Brazil, and they had the same language for the first time on diversity. Linnaeus was purely about similarity. He classified things based on yellow. All the yellow things go in this box. Or, for example, every animal that was kind of roundy, like a jellyfish or a starfish, we'll put them in one group because they're roundy. He was all about similarity. And this is just an invertebrate thing. The radiants were animals with round bodies. Are these two closely related groups of animals? Do you know? These are the very opposite ends of the animal kingdom. This is an incredibly primitive, simple animal. This is a very at the top end animal. But he put them in the same group because of their shape. So no concept of relatedness in Linnaeus. He would have been very unhappy with any idea of evolution. So this was not really systematics. This was, I don't know what we'd call this. This was classifying by similarity. Okay. Linnaean classification was very much about appreciating and understanding the gift of creation. And actually, in his day, and shortly after, we had whole books on this. The wisdom of God manifested in the works of creation. People in this day studied and understood the living world in order to better appreciate the gift that they saw it as. And it's very sad that the evangelical tradition, at least in our country, has lost this appreciation of the natural world. So, Linnaean classification. Order is based purely on similarity. He had no patterns in nomenclature. He just named things as he felt like naming them. And he had no concept of relationships. But it was a starting point. Darwin came along. There he is. Darwin came along, and as I mentioned earlier, got us thinking about evolutionary relationships. And he got us thinking that the living things on our planet are interrelated to one another. In the Linnaean world, everything was created. In the Darwinian world, everything is interrelated. And so Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859, almost exactly 100 years after Linnaeus' important edition. And with Darwin, we get true systematics. Now we're classifying things because we think they're related to one another, not just because they're all yellow or they're all round. And so Darwin would have looked at these things and said, yeah, they're superficially similar in that they're round, but there's nothing else about them that's similar. We're not going to put them close together in their relatedness. We're going to separate them. That's an evolutionary classification. Two very distantly related creatures, because their evolutionary relationship is distant. So in Darwin's world, similarity might tell us about relationships, but it might not as well. Similarity might just be coincidental. We have to be careful about that. Okay. All right. So systematics is the mingling of evolution and classification. And once we start doing this, it gets complicated. All right, a couple more things and then we'll take our second break. Yeah, we're in a good spot here. So classification is at its core, at its base, is about communication, effective communication. Different scientists want to be able to communicate with each other. We want a system, a common system, so we can share our views and our discoveries. That's one function of classification. But another function of classification is that we want it to reflect relationships. If we put these 5 species into one genus, we're saying they're closely related to one another. So classification on one end is going to be reflecting relationships. On the other end, it's about communication. Now, if communication is your priority, nothing ever changes, right? You want one classification, and we're all using it, and it never changes. But if it's about relationships, gosh, our understanding of those sometimes changes, because we can see these two things are in conflict with each other. So, stability allows for good communication, nothing changing. But reflecting relationships is how we derive our classification, and this sometimes changes as our opinions, as our new discoveries are made. Our opinions change. So these things are in conflict with each other. And you guys taking classes from Sean Anderson? He's pulled me aside a couple times and complained about taxonomists. And he said, I'm working with this organism, you guys changed its name. I said, well, I didn't do it. But some scientists said, oh, damn, we've had this species of whatever in the wrong genus. We thought it was related to these guys. Someone looked at it closely, no, it's over here. And he was telling me, I've been studying this for 10 years and suddenly the name's different. And now I can't find it in the literature anymore because I don't know what it's called. And I said, well, you get like a cheat sheet. But he is all about this. So, example, here's the animal phyla. There's an older classification. This is the one that we use now. It's the one that textbook you have. It's kind of cool. We're not doing it in this class, but we'll do it in the fall. Come back. There it is right in the end sheets. That's the entire animal kingdom. There. That's almost the most modern view of the arrangement of the different phyla. So again, older, newer. And if you sat down and looked at this and looked at the phyla across the top and compared these two, these are from your Bio 200 textbook about 6 years ago, about 2 years ago. They're quite different. That's because our understanding of relationships has changed. And so that's the older understanding, that's the current understanding. Well, we want our classification to reflect the evolutionary tree. It used to reflect this, now it has to reflect this. So changes are made. Things get moved around. And that causes the classification to be unstable. The names become a little bit mobile. That's just something you have to deal with. Sean just has to learn to deal with that. That's what I told him. He said there should be a rule that you can only change the name of things once every 10 years. You don't think that's funny? I thought that was hilarious. So a change in relationships requires alterations to the classification to reflect that new set of understanding. And if we alter what we think are the relationships, modifications of the nomenclature are often necessary because the nomenclature has to match the classification. I know it sounds very arcane, but it actually that's why in a class like this we don't focus on the finer details of classification because it's a moving target. Not so much in vertebrates, but in other groups it'd be really hard to nail down. Just an example, a couple examples. I grew up, this big dinosaur, right? Big one, big four-leg. I grew up in all the kids' books and dinosaur books when I was growing up, it was called Brontosaurus. But someone examined the specimens, reanalyzed the relationships and the identity, and the correct name is actually an older name called Apatosaurus, and so you may be familiar with that. But in all the older books it's called Brontosaurus. But our understandings of relationships changed, the name had to change. And it's now Apatosaurus. My daughter, who learned her dinosaurs 10 years ago, never heard of Brontosaurus. This is a very widespread game fish. Right there, there's a picture of it. It's the rainbow trout, also called the steelhead trout. For 150 years, its name was Salmo gardnerii. And in tons and tons and tons of fisheries literature and angling literature and biological literature, it's called Salmo gardnerii. And then about 20 years ago now, someone got into the relationships of the salmon and the trout and said, oh damn, we've been doing this wrong, and rearranged our understanding of the evolutionary tree, and the name had to change. And now it's called Oncorhynchus micus, which is much harder to spell. And that's correct. Our understanding of relationships changed, that the names sometimes have to change. They don't always have to change, but sometimes they do. This was so controversial that they had, this is out of a fisheries scientific journal. Jerry Smith, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, actually wrote a paper explaining to the fisheries biologists why it changed, because they were really unhappy with it. The guys who work within hatcheries were really unhappy. So Jerry explained it to them. They're still unhappy about it. Okay. Let's take our second break. Are we doing okay? So I know it's review for some of you. Who's had invert from me? By the way, anyone take an invert? So just one of you? And who took ichthyology, fish classes? I recognize, okay, a few of you. Okay, so not even a third of you. And this is vert, so there we are. I'm going to get a drink, so another 3-4 minutes. We'll go to 11. Yeah, I'll come back around 11. So I'll start again. My voice is going to disappear so